You want to know about debt? About what it means to pay and pay and pay until there's nothing left of yourself? Let me tell you about debt. Let me tell you about the kind of debt that doesn't show up on credit reports, that doesn't have interest rates or payment plans, that just bleeds you dry one transfer at a time until you're hollow inside, wondering who the hell you even are anymore. My name is Evelyn Harris. I'm 62 years old, and I've been paying debts I never owed for longer than I care to admit. You think you know what sacrifice looks like? You think you understand what it means to give everything for your child? You don't know shit. You don't know what it's like to watch your own son stand in front of a room full of people and mock the very thing that kept him afloat for 5 goddamn years. To my mother, the woman who taught me that guilt is the best currency. That's what he said. That's what my boy, my Daniel, my flesh and blood, said about me in front of his wife's family while they laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Like I was some pathetic old woman who used manipulation instead of love. Like everything I'd given him was nothing more than emotional blackmail. You know what I wanted to do in that moment? I wanted to stand up and tell every single person in that room exactly how much Daniel's pride had cost me. I wanted to pull out my bank statements and show them the monthly transfers, the depleted savings account, the pills I didn't buy because I couldn't afford them and his rent at the same time. I wanted to scream until my throat was raw about what real guilt looks like. It looks like a mother choosing between her medication and her son's lies. But I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling something inside me crack and finally break after years of bending. And when the laughter died down and everyone was looking at me, expecting me to take it like I always did, expecting me to smile and nod and play the part of the dotty old mother who doesn't know any better, I looked my son in the eye and said the truest thing I'd spoken in 5 years, "Then you'll be broke soon, Daniel. I'm done paying your debts." The silence that followed was beautiful. It was the sound of a house of cards finally collapsing, the sound of truth cutting through bullshit like a knife through tissue paper. I watched my son's face freeze, watched his wife's smile turn brittle, watched the whole carefully constructed lie start to crumble right there at the dinner table. You want to know how we got there? You want to know how a woman who raised her boy with nothing but love and hope and endless goddamn optimism ended up being the punchline to his joke? Let me tell you a story about good intentions and the road to hell. I was a nurse for 37 years. 37 years of double shifts and night shifts and holiday shifts, of holding people's hands while they died, of cleaning up blood and vomit and tears, of caring for everyone else's pain while swallowing my own. When my husband died 15 years ago, cancer took him slow and mean. I thought I'd paid my dues to suffering. I thought maybe I could finally rest, finally enjoy the quiet years I'd earned. Daniel was 27 then, working his way up at some finance company, living in a studio apartment that smelled like ramen and regret. He was trying so hard to make something of himself, and God help me, I was proud. I was so fucking proud of that boy, the way he wore his cheap suits like armor, the way he talked about his dreams like they were certainties instead of wishes. He was everything his father would have been proud of, everything I'd hoped for when I was working those night shifts and trying to keep us afloat on nurses' wages. Then he met Clara. Clara Westmont, with her porcelain skin and her trust fund and her parents who owned half of Manhattan. Clara, who looked at my boy like he was something exotic and charming, a project to be polished and presented. The first time he brought her home for dinner, I knew I was in trouble. Not because she was cruel, she wasn't, not outright. But she had that particular kind of blindness that comes with never having wanted for anything, that inability to see the difference between shabby and broken. "Your home is so quaint," she said, running her finger along my kitchen counter like she was checking for dust. She meant it as a compliment, I think. In her world, quaint was probably charming. In my world, quaint meant the wallpaper was peeling and I couldn't afford to fix it. I watched Daniel's face as she said it, watched him see our little house through her eyes. The chipped plates that had been wedding gifts 30 years ago. The furniture I'd bought piece by piece at garage sales and thrift stores. The carpet that had been walked on by 1,000 patients' families when I used to host the support group meetings. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd been proud of, suddenly looked small and sad and insufficient. That's when the lying started. That's when my boy, my honest, hard-working boy, started building a life on a foundation of deception, and somehow I became the contractor. "Mom," he said after Clara left that night, his voice careful and guilty in that way that meant he was about to ask for something he knew he shouldn't. "Clara's parents think I own my apartment. They think I'm more established than I am. It's just temporary, until I get the promotion. Just until things get better. Just until." Those 2 words became the theme song of the next 5 years of my life. Just until he got the promotion. Just until Clara's parents accepted him. Just until they got engaged. Just until the wedding. Just until they found their own place. Just until. $900 a month. That's what just until cost me. $900 out of my pension, every month, for 5 goddamn years. Do you know what $900 means to a widow living on a fixed income? It means choosing between heating and groceries. It means walking to the pharmacy instead of taking the bus because you can't spare the fare. It means telling your friends you can't go to dinner because you're watching your budget, and watching their faces change as they realize you're not being careful, you're being poor. But I paid it. Every month, like clockwork, I transferred $900 into Daniel's account and watched my own balance dwindle. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was investment in his future, in his happiness. I told myself that good mothers sacrifice, that's what they do, they give until it hurts and then they give some more. I canceled my painting class, the one thing I'd been looking forward to in retirement, the one dream I'd saved for myself. Just temporarily, I told myself, using Daniel's favorite phrase. Just until things get better. I sold my wedding ring, the one piece of jewelry I'd sworn I'd never part with. I told myself William would understand, that he'd want me to help our boy. I stopped buying my blood pressure medication every month, started skipping doses to make it last longer. Who was going to notice if an old woman's health started failing? Who was keeping track of what Evelyn Harris was giving up for love? Every time I sent that transfer, I told myself it was worth it. Every time I saw Daniel's face light up when he talked about Clara, about their plans, about the life they were building together, I told myself this was what mothers did. We suffered in silence so our children could shine. We made ourselves smaller so they could be bigger. We paid debts that weren't ours because love doesn't keep receipts. But love shouldn't feel like debt. Love shouldn't make you count pills and skip meals and lie to your friends about why you can't afford a $10 lunch. Love shouldn't make you feel like you're drowning while watching someone else learn to swim with the life preserver you threw them. 5 years. $54,000. Do you know what I could have done with $54,000? I could have fixed my roof, the one that leaked every time it rained and made me put buckets in my bedroom. I could have replaced my ancient car, the one that broke down twice a month and left me stranded at grocery stores. I could have taken the trip to Ireland that William and I had always planned, could have seen the cliffs of Moher he used to talk about when he was dying. I could have lived instead of just surviving. But Daniel was thriving. Daniel was glowing with success and love and the kind of confidence that comes from having your problems solved by someone else's sacrifice. He got the promotion, the one that was supposed to make the payments unnecessary. He got the engagement, the beautiful ring, the announcement in the society pages. He got the wedding, the big white dress affair with flowers that cost more than my monthly income and a reception that went until dawn. And through it all, I kept paying. Because by then it wasn't about the money anymore, was it? It was about the lie we'd built together, the fiction that Daniel Harris was a self-made man who'd earned everything he had. I'd become complicit in my own erasure, a silent partner in his success story, the ghost who paid the bills while he took the credit. I should have stopped after the promotion. Should have stopped after the engagement, after the wedding, after any of the dozen milestones that were supposed to mark the end of Just Until. But stopping would have meant admitting that I'd been a fool, that I'd let my son use me, that I'd participated in my own financial destruction out of some misguided notion of maternal love. So I kept paying, and Daniel kept taking, and Clara kept believing that her husband was the kind of man who'd built everything himself. And I kept getting smaller and smaller, like a photograph left in the sun, fading until there was almost nothing left. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were grocery days, and I was sitting in my kitchen with my calculator and my stack of bills, trying to figure out how to make $73 last until the next pension check. My friend Margaret had stopped by with coffee and gossip, the way she did every week, and she was flipping through one of those glossy magazines while I pretended to balance my checkbook. "Oh my God, Evelyn, look at this," she said, holding up the magazine with excitement. "Isn't this your Daniel?" I looked up, and there he was. My boy, my Daniel, smiling on the page of Manhattan Lifestyle magazine like he owned the world. The headline read "Power Couples of Manhattan, Young Professionals Making Their Mark." There was my son in his expensive suit, his arm around Clara in her designer dress, standing in front of what the caption called their stunning Upper East Side apartment. But it was the quote underneath that made my blood turn to ice: "We built everything ourselves." It hasn't always been easy, but we believe in earning what you have. There's something to be said for making your own way in the world. We built everything ourselves. Ourselves. Not we had help. Not we're grateful for family support. Ourselves. Like I didn't exist. Like those $54,000 had materialized out of thin air. Like my sacrifice was so meaningless it wasn't even worth acknowledging. I stared at that page until the words blurred, until my hands started shaking, until something deep in my chest cracked open and let out all the rage I'd been swallowing for 5 years. Margaret kept talking, going on about how proud I must be, how successful Daniel looked, how lucky I was to have such an accomplished son. But all I could hear was the sound of my own foolishness echoing in my head. "Everything," I whispered, and Margaret stopped talking. "What, honey?" "Everything." The word stung. Because I knew who helped build it. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a bottle of wine, the good stuff I'd been saving for some special occasion that never seemed to come, and I sat at my kitchen table and I added it all up. Not just the money, though God knows that was enough to make me sick. The real cost. The cost in dignity, in self-respect, in the slow erosion of everything I'd thought I was worth. $54,000 in cash. The painting class I'd given up. The medications I'd skipped. The social events I'd declined because I couldn't afford them. The repairs I'd postponed until my house started falling apart around me. The dreams I'd set aside because there was no room for them in a budget dominated by my son's lies. But more than that. More than money. I'd given up my voice. I'd given up my right to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter in my own son's story. I'd become a supporting character in my own life, the invisible benefactor who made everything possible while staying carefully out of the spotlight. That's when I decided it was time for a reckoning. I called Daniel the next morning and invited him for dinner. "Just the two of us," I said. "Like old times." He sounded surprised. I hadn't asked him to come alone in years, not since Clara had become the priority, the center of his universe. But he agreed, probably because he thought I was lonely, probably because he thought it would be a nice gesture to humor his pathetic old mother. I spent the day cooking all his favorites. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way I used to make it when he was little and money was tight but love was abundant. Homemade bread that filled the house with the smell of childhood. Apple pie with vanilla ice cream, because he used to say it tasted like happiness. I set the table with my good china, the wedding set I'd inherited from my mother and never used anymore because what was the point? I lit candles. I opened another bottle of wine. I wanted it to be perfect, this last supper of sorts, this final act of maternal love before I burned the whole charade to the ground. Daniel arrived right on time, looking handsome and successful and completely oblivious to what was coming. He hugged me, complimented the smell, asked about my health with the kind of dutiful concern that children show their aging parents. We ate and talked about safe things, his work, his colleagues, the weather. He told me about a vacation he and Clara were planning, some resort in the Caribbean that cost more per night than I spend on groceries in a month. You should travel more, Mom, he said, reaching for seconds on the pot roast. You've earned it. I almost laughed at that. Earned it? With what money? But I just smiled and refilled his wine glass and waited for the right moment. It came during dessert. He was relaxed, a little drunk on wine and nostalgia, telling me some story about Clara's parents and their yacht. That's when I got up and went to the kitchen, returning with a manila folder that I placed on the table between us. What's this? He asked, still smiling. I opened the folder and spread the contents across the white tablecloth. Bank statements. Transfer receipts. 5 years' worth of documentation, arranged in neat little rows like evidence in a trial. $900 every month for 5 years, I said, my voice steady and calm. $54,000. Tell me, Daniel, how much did your pride cost? I watched the color drain from his face, watched his mouth open and close like a fish gasping for air. He started to stammer, to reach for explanations and justifications, but I held up my hand. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Don't tell me it was temporary, don't tell me you were going to pay me back, don't tell me any of the lies you've been telling yourself to make this okay. Mom, No. The word came out harder than I'd intended, sharp enough to cut. You don't get to talk right now. You get to listen. For once in 5 years, you get to shut up and listen to someone else. He sat back in his chair like I'd slapped him. Maybe I should have. Maybe that would have been kinder than what came next. Do you know what $54,000 means to someone like me, Daniel? Do you have any fucking idea what that money represented? The profanity felt good in my mouth, liberating. I'd been polite for so long, so careful with my words, so afraid of being the difficult mother, the burden, the problem. That money was my security. My peace of mind. My insurance against becoming one of those old women who die alone in nursing homes because they can't afford anything better. That money was my freedom, and I gave it to you because I thought you needed it more than I did. Because I thought it was love. It was love, Mom. It is love. I'm grateful. Grateful? I laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. You're grateful? Is that what you call it when you erase someone from your own success story? When you tell magazines that you built everything yourself while sitting in an apartment I paid for? He had the grace to look ashamed at that, at least. His eyes dropped to the table, to the evidence of his deception spread out like a feast of truth. I lost my savings, Daniel. My health. My peace. So you could impress people who'll never care about you the way I do. So you could pretend to be something you're not. So you could build a marriage on a foundation of lies. You're making this sound worse than it is, he said, and there it was, the defensiveness, the inability to just accept responsibility without qualification. It's not like you needed the money for anything important. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, this person I'd sacrificed everything for, and realized he had no idea who I was. To him, I was just Mom, a supporting character whose only purpose was to provide whatever he needed. The idea that I might have wants, needs, dreams of my own had never occurred to him. Not important, I repeated slowly. My medication isn't important. My leaking roof isn't important. My broken-down car isn't important. The trip to Ireland your father and I planned before he died isn't important. The painting class I gave up isn't important. My dignity isn't important. Mom, that's not what I meant. Yes, it is. That's exactly what you meant. Because if my needs were important to you, you would have asked about them. You would have wondered how I was managing to send you $900 a month on a pension. You would have noticed that I stopped going out, stopped buying new clothes, stopped living my own life. But you didn't ask, did you? Because you didn't want to know the answer. I stood up then, started gathering the bank statements with shaking hands. The rage was giving way to something else now, something deeper and more painful. Disappointment. The kind of soul-crushing disappointment that comes from realizing that the person you love most in the world sees you as nothing more than a resource to be depleted. You want to know what's not important, Daniel? This whole conversation. Because it's 5 years too late. The damage is done. I'm broke, I'm tired, and I'm done pretending that your success is worth my destruction. You're being dramatic, he said, and that's when I snapped. Dramatic? You think I'm being dramatic? I slammed the folder down on the table hard enough to make the wine glasses jump. You want dramatic? Let me tell you about dramatic. Dramatic is choosing between blood pressure medication and your son's rent. Dramatic is selling your wedding ring to keep up the payments. Dramatic is lying to your friends about why you can't afford a $10 lunch because you're too ashamed to admit your own son is bleeding you dry. I never asked you to. You never asked? You never asked? I was shouting now, something I'd never done in front of Daniel, something that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. You asked me every month for 5 years. Every time you called and told me about your temporary situation. Every time you made me complicit in your lies. Every time you let me pay for your pride while you took all the credit. I was going to pay you back. When? When were you going to pay me back, Daniel? After you told the whole world that you built everything yourself? After you convinced your wife that you're some kind of self-made success story? When exactly were you planning to acknowledge that your mother financed your entire adult life? He was crying now, my strong, successful son, tears running down his face like a little boy who'd been caught in a lie. But I felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort him the way I had 1,000 times before. This was his mess, his shame to carry. I never meant for it to go on this long, he whispered. But it did go on. For 5 years, it went on. While you were building your career and your marriage and your reputation, I was getting smaller and smaller, disappearing bit by bit until there was almost nothing left of me. And you didn't notice. You didn't care. As long as the money kept coming, you were happy to let me fade away. I walked to the window, looked out at the darkness beyond. My reflection stared back, the face of a woman who'd given too much for too long, who'd confused love with self-destruction and called it sacrifice. Do you know what the worst part is? I said without turning around. It's not the money. Money can be earned back, saved again. It's not even the things I gave up. Those were choices I made, stupid as they were. I turned to face him, this man who was my son but felt like a stranger. The worst part is that you made me disappear from my own life. You made me complicit in my own erasure. You took my voice, my story, my right to exist as anything other than your secret benefactor. And I let you. God help me, I let you do it because I thought that's what love looked like. Mom, please. No. I'm done pleasing people. I'm done making myself smaller so other people can feel bigger. I'm done being the woman behind the man, the invisible hand that makes everything possible while staying carefully out of sight. I sat back down, suddenly exhausted, empty of the rage that had been sustaining me. I'm done, Daniel. I'm finally done. What does that mean? It means no more money. No more transfers. No more enabling your lies or financing your pride. It means you get to find out what you're really worth when you're not spending my savings. The panic in his eyes was immediate and sharp. "Mom, you can't just cut me off. Clara and I have expenses, we have a lifestyle. You have a lifestyle built on my sacrifice. Maybe it's time to find out what kind of lifestyle you can afford on your own." "You're punishing me." "No, Daniel. I'm saving myself. Finally, after 5 years of drowning, I'm saving myself." He left that night without finishing his pie, without helping with the dishes, without saying goodbye. He just gathered his coat and walked out into the darkness, leaving me alone with the evidence of his deception and the wreckage of my own stupidity. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't send the monthly transfer. I sat at my computer on the first of the month, my finger hovering over the keys, and I chose myself. I chose my own survival over his comfort. I chose honesty over enablement. It felt like rebellion. It felt like revolution. The silence that followed was beautiful and terrible. Days passed without a call. Then weeks. I'd expected anger, arguments, attempts at manipulation. Instead, I got nothing. Radio silence. As if I'd only existed as a source of funding, and now that the money had stopped, there was no reason to maintain contact. That silence told me everything I needed to know about what I'd really meant to my son. Not love. Not family. Just utility. A resource that had finally run dry. The news came through Margaret, the way gossip always does in small circles. Daniel had lost his job. Budget cuts, his company had said, but Margaret's daughter worked in finance and heard it was performance-related. Word was he'd been struggling for months, missing deadlines, making mistakes. The pressure of maintaining his lifestyle had finally caught up with him. Clara left 2 weeks later. Moved back to her parents' house, filed for separation, took half of everything in their carefully curated life. The apartment they couldn't afford without my subsidies went up for sale. The expensive car got repossessed. The country club membership lapsed. When the pretending stopped, everything else fell apart too. All those carefully constructed lies collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane, leaving nothing but the truth in their wake. And the truth was ugly. The truth was that my son had built his entire adult life on a foundation of deception and his mother's sacrifice. When that foundation crumbled, there was nothing left to hold up the facade. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt satisfied that justice had finally been served, that the bill for his pride had finally come due. But mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the time we'd lost, for the relationship we'd destroyed, for the man he might have been if he'd learned to value honesty over appearance. Months passed. My bank account slowly began to recover. I bought new medication, fixed my roof, replaced my ancient car with something reliable. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. I enrolled in a pottery class, not painting like I'd originally planned, but something new, something that felt like beginning again rather than returning to the past. I was learning to live for myself again, to remember what it felt like to matter in my own story. It was harder than I'd expected, after years of existing in the margins of my own life. But it was also liberating, like stretching muscles that had been cramped for too long. Then Daniel showed up at my door. It was a Tuesday again. I seemed to have a thing with Tuesdays, and I was coming home from my pottery class, my hands still dusty with clay, when I found him sitting on my front steps. He looked different. Thinner, quieter, wearing clothes that actually fit his budget instead of his aspirations. "Hi, Mom." 2 words, but they carried the weight of months of silence, of pride swallowed and lessons learned. He looked like a man who'd been through a storm and come out the other side different than when he went in. "Daniel." I unlocked the door, but I didn't invite him in. Not yet. I wasn't ready to be that generous with my forgiveness. "I lost everything," he said, still sitting on the steps like a penitent. "I know. Clara's gone. The apartment, the job, all of it. Gone." I know that too. He looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: humility. Real humility, not the performed kind he'd mastered for Clara's parents. I've been working, he said. Temp jobs, mostly. Data entry, filing. Nothing glamorous. I'm living in a studio in Queens, riding the subway, eating ramen again. Good, I said, and meant it. Honest work never killed anyone. I want to make this right. You can't. You can't give me back 5 years of my life, Daniel. You can't undo the choices I made or the things I gave up. You can't resurrect my savings account or my peace of mind or my trust in you. His face crumpled at that, and I felt a familiar tug of maternal sympathy. But I pushed it down. Sympathy was what had gotten me into this mess in the first place. But, I continued, you can stop making it worse. You can learn to live honestly. You can build something real instead of something pretty. You can become the man I always hoped you were instead of the man you pretended to be. I don't know how. You start small. You start with the truth. You start by admitting that you fucked up, that you used me, that you built your life on a lie. And then you figure out who you are when you're not pretending to be someone else. I sat down beside him on the steps, close enough to smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something new: humility, maybe, or just the absence of arrogance. You don't owe me anything, Daniel. Not money, not apologies, not grand gestures. You owe yourself something better than the life you were living. You owe yourself the chance to be proud of something you actually earned. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over my little neighborhood with its modest houses and honest people. It wasn't glamorous, wasn't the kind of place that made it into lifestyle magazines. But it was real, and after years of living in the shadow of lies, real felt pretty fucking good. Can I help you fix the porch? He asked eventually. It looks like it needs work. I looked at the sagging boards, the peeling paint, the accumulated neglect of years when there was no money for repairs. It does need work. But I can afford to hire someone now. I know. But I'd like to do it anyway. Not to pay you back, just to do something good. Something real. That's how the healing started. Not with grand apologies or dramatic gestures, but with Daniel showing up every Saturday with tools and lumber, learning to build something honest with his hands. We worked mostly in silence, the steady rhythm of hammers and saws saying what words couldn't. He never moved back home, that would have been regression, not progress. But he visited regularly, helped with small repairs, brought his paychecks from his unglamorous but honest jobs. He was learning to live within his means, to find satisfaction in simple accomplishments, to measure success by different standards than the ones that had nearly destroyed us both. 2 years passed. 2 years of rebuilding, not just my house but our relationship, my sense of self, his understanding of what really mattered. I learned to trust again, carefully and with conditions, but trust nonetheless. He learned to give without expecting anything in return, to show up consistently instead of dramatically. And then he met Sarah. Sarah Chen, a social worker who drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment filled with books and rescued plants. Sarah, who looked at my modest house and saw home instead of poverty, who complimented my cooking and meant it, who brought me sunflowers because they were cheerful and cheap and she thought I needed both. The first time Daniel brought her for dinner, I watched him introduce me without shame, without qualification, without the careful editing that had characterized his relationship with Clara. This is my mom, Evelyn. She raised me alone after my dad died, worked as a nurse for 37 years, and taught me everything I know about resilience. Not perfect, not wealthy, not impressive by society's standards. Just real. Just honest. Just enough. Your son talks about you constantly, Sarah told me as we cleared the dishes together. He says you taught him that integrity is worth more than appearance. I glanced at Daniel, deep in conversation with Sarah's brother about baseball statistics and weekend plans. He caught my eye and smiled, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine happiness there. Not the desperate, grasping happiness of someone trying to maintain a facade, but the quiet contentment of someone who'd learned to appreciate what he actually had. He's still learning, I said. We both are. Aren't we all? That night, after they'd gone home to Sarah's little apartment where they split the rent and cooked together and built something modest and real, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and thought about debt. Real debt, not the emotional manipulation Daniel had accused me of. The debt we owe to ourselves to live honestly. The debt we owe to the people we love to see them clearly, to value them properly, to treat them as whole human beings instead of resources to be consumed. I thought about the debt Daniel had finally started paying, not to me, but to himself, to the man he could have been all along if he'd had the courage to be ordinary, to be enough without being extraordinary. The garden was full of flowers now, planted with money that used to go to his rent. Sunflowers like the ones Sarah brought, sturdy and bright and unpretentious. Tomatoes that would feed me through the summer. Herbs that made my small meals taste like abundance. I was 64 now, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a future. Not because Daniel had learned to value me, though that helped, but because I'd learned to value myself. I'd learned that love shouldn't require you to disappear, that sacrifice shouldn't leave you empty, that being a mother didn't mean being a martyr. The house around me was solid now, repaired and painted and mine in ways it hadn't been for years. The walls no longer leaked, the floors no longer sagged, the windows let in light instead of cold. Daniel had helped with some of it, but most of it I'd done myself, learning late in life that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. My bank account wasn't fat, but it was stable. My health had improved once I could afford my medications regularly. My social life had expanded beyond Margaret's weekly visits to include pottery classmates and book club members and neighbors who'd become friends. I was living my own life again, finally, after years of existing in the margins of someone else's story. Last month, Daniel called to tell me he was engaged. Not to announce it in some grand gesture or to ask for money for a ring he couldn't afford, but to share his happiness with someone he loved. The ring was small, the proposal simple, the plans modest. They were thinking of a courthouse wedding followed by dinner at their favorite restaurant, nothing fancy, nothing designed to impress anyone but themselves. "Mom, I finally bought something with my own money," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice, not the desperate pride of someone trying to maintain appearances, but the quiet satisfaction of honest accomplishment. "What's that?" I asked, though I already knew. "Peace of mind." Peace of mind. Such a simple thing, really. Such an ordinary miracle. But after years of living on borrowed everything, borrowed money, borrowed status, borrowed happiness, peace of mind felt like the greatest luxury of all. We talked for an hour that day, about wedding plans and work projects and the small, real details of lives lived honestly. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, uncomplicated happiness for my son's success. Not the anxious, costly pride of watching him pretend to be someone else, but genuine joy at seeing him become himself. That evening, I walked through my garden as the sun set, touching the leaves of plants I'd grown with money that used to buy lies. The tomatoes were heavy on the vine, the sunflowers tall and proud, the herbs fragrant with the promise of good meals to come. I used to think motherhood meant giving everything. I used to believe that love required sacrifice, that caring meant paying whatever price was asked, that being a good mother meant making myself smaller so my child could be bigger. Now I know better. Now I know that motherhood means teaching your children when to stop taking. That love means believing someone is capable of standing on their own. That being a good mother sometimes means saying no, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I know that real love builds people up instead of using them up. That authentic relationships are based on truth instead of transaction. That the best gift you can give someone you love is the expectation that they can be better than they are. Daniel is learning these lessons too, slowly, and sometimes painfully. Sarah is helping, not by fixing his problems but by loving him without requiring him to be anything other than who he is. They're building something together from the ground up, something honest and sustainable and theirs. And I'm building too. Not just my house or my garden or my bank account, but myself. The woman I was before I forgot that I mattered. The woman who can love without losing herself, who can give without being depleted, who can be proud of her son without being ashamed of her own needs. It's taken me 64 years to learn that I am not a supporting character in anyone else's story, not even my son's. I'm the protagonist of my own life, the one who gets to decide what matters, what's worth paying for, what debts are worth carrying. And I've decided that the only debt worth paying is the one I owe to myself, the debt of living honestly, of valuing my own worth, of remembering that love multiplies when it's real and divides when it's not. The sun has set completely now, and my garden is bathed in moonlight, silver and peaceful and mine. Tomorrow I'll tend the plants and pay my bills and live my own life with the quiet satisfaction of someone who's finally learned the difference between giving and being taken from. Daniel will call on Sunday, like he does every week now. We'll talk about ordinary things, the weather, his work, Sarah's latest rescue cat. Nothing dramatic, nothing desperate, nothing requiring me to choose between his happiness and my own survival. Just love. Real love. The kind that builds instead of depletes, that sees instead of uses, that honors the whole person instead of just the parts that are useful. It only took me 5 years and $54,000 to learn the difference. Some lessons are expensive. But some lessons, the ones that teach you who you really are and what you're really worth, are priceless. I'm Evelyn Harris. I'm 64 years old. I'm a retired nurse, a gardener, a potter, a woman who learned late in life that she matters. I'm nobody's supporting character, nobody's secret benefactor, nobody's invisible hand. I'm just me. Finally, completely, unapologetically me. And that's enough. More than enough. It's everything.